In my last video, I brought you through the step-by-step process of exactly how we built this tiny home. Now we're going to bring you through the process of how we build the entire interior, build a deck, and show you the final results. If you missed part 1, click the video that I'm going to link above. Now that the exterior of this tiny home is complete, it's time to wire it up so we can install our insulation. I picked up a 125 amp breaker panel and installed it onto one of the 2x4s 64 inches high. I then installed my receptacle boxes and made sure they were sticking out by about a half an inch so the drywall will lay flush with the receptacles. I then marked 2 feet on all the studs and drilled 3/4 inch holes so I can run all my wires through. I ran the wire from the exterior soffit lights into the receptacle box for my light switches. I then prepped them and rolled them into the box so I can come back later in the video and connect them to my switches. Since we're going to be installing a deck, we decided it would be a good idea to install an outlet on the outside of this tiny home. And since this is going to be outside, we decided to go with a GFI outlet and an exterior box to make sure it's nice and waterproof. Then came from the inside and added some spray foam insulation just to make sure no bugs get in. I ran the wire into the electrical box, then hammered on these metal wire protectors just to make sure I don't accidentally screw into the wire while I'm hanging the sheetrock. The next day, it was finally time to install the insulation. We picked up 5 bags of Havelock wool, which is a non-toxic alternative to your traditional insulation. And since this is a loose fill insulation, we started by stapling the netting that it came with, and slowly started filling the wall with insulation starting from the bottom and working our way up. If you notice, I'm installing this without using gloves or a mask, because it's natural and made out of 100% wool, which is the reason I decided to go with this brand instead of some of these other brands that you find at your local hardware store. And the R value of this insulation is 15, which surpasses the local building code, so that's exactly what we want for this tiny home. This was quite time consuming to do, but when you're spending 15 grand on a tiny home for your backyard, we're gonna do it right. My son then finally made it out of bed, so he also came over to give us a hand. We then cut out the excess netting that was in front of all the receptacle boxes, and just like that, the entire tiny home was insulated. Now that the tiny home is insulated, it's time to install the sheetrock. I've only done sheetrock a couple times in my life, so I'm nowhere near an expert, but after watching a bunch of YouTube videos, I felt pretty determined. After doing a bunch of measuring, I used an oscillating tool to cut out the hole for my electrical panel, then basically repeated the same process over and over again until I had all my sheetrock hung. Now that all the drywall is installed, I picked up some sheetrock tape and went along all the seams and edges so I can start to install my joint compound. I spread a generous layer over the tape and all the screw holes while still making it look as flat as possible, because if you leave a bunch of high spots, this stuff gets as hard as a rock and it's really hard to sand. I finished installing all the joint compound, but I had to wait at least 24 hours before sanding it, so I decided to start working on the ceiling while it dried. For the ceiling, we're using the same tongue and groove pine boards that we used earlier in the video, so we started off by staining them the same color as the soffit and letting them sit overnight, then adding a thick layer of polyurethane to make sure they stay nice and protected. There was 42 boards in total, so it legit took a day and a half just to stain and seal them, which is part of the reason why it takes so long to produce these videos, so if you're watching, I really appreciate it. I then made a bunch of measurements on my roof joists and drilled a bunch of holes so I can run my wires through. My ceiling's gonna have a total of 8 lights, so I left a bunch of slack where each light would go so I can come back later in the video and use it so I can wire up my lights. I also hammered on a bunch of metal wire protectors so I don't accidentally nail into the wire while I'm hanging my ceiling. I then rolled out more insulation netting from earlier in the video, cut it to size, then started stapling it onto the ceiling because this is what's going to hold all my insulation up. I also added these pieces of foam insulation in between each rafter because my roof is slanted and I don't want the insulation all to fall down to one end over time. I stuffed each cavity with insulation, but didn't pack it too tightly to allow the air from the soffit vents to circulate through. Now that the roof is insulated, it's time to install the ceiling. These are the same tongue and groove boards that we stained and sealed earlier in the video, and we're securing them onto the roof using 18 gauge finish nails and a shit ton of backbreaking labor. We staggered the board so we don't have a continuous seam down the middle of the ceiling, and continued the same process over and over again until all of our boards were hung up. And just like that, we have a finished ceiling that's ready for some lighting. We drilled 6-inch holes, then pulled out the wire that we installed earlier in the video, connected the wires into the junction box that came with the lights, then clipped them into the ceiling and repeated the same process over and over until all 8 lights were up. Once we finished installing the lights, it was time to sand all the sheetrock to get it ready for paint. And I didn't show this in the video, but we sanded and reapplied spackle for 3 days in a row just to try to get these walls as flat as possible, but I didn't post the entire process because I didn't want to bore you guys to death. Once the walls were ready to go, it was finally time to lay down some paint. For the paint, we're using Showcase Paint and Primer 1 Coat Guaranteed from Sherwin-Williams, and starting off by trimming all the edges, then rolling on the rest. Now that the entire tiny home is painted, it's finally time to install the floor. We ordered a sample box from Flooret to help us decide what floor we wanted for this tiny home, then stapled down a roll of underlayment onto the entire floor. We chose their Nakan LVP flooring that has a built-in underlayment, but added an extra 2mm layer even though it's not required. These floor planks were huge. It only took 2.5 pieces to cover the entire length of the tiny home, which was pretty cool because it saved a lot of time and it looked really nice as well. I spent the extra money on this brand because these floor planks are much thicker and don't break as easy on all the edges that click together. They're also 100% waterproof, and it took us about 45 minutes to install the entire floor. We even did a durability test and they seem to hold up really well. The quality of these floors went above and beyond my expectations. I'm very particular with the type of flooring that I choose because some of the other brands that I've used in the past lift when they get wet and just break when you're installing them. I'm going to put a link in the description for all the products we used throughout this entire build, including the floor. Now that the floor is complete, it's finally time to install our receptacle outlets and switches. I made sure all the lights and outlets worked, then went straight to installing the baseboards and trim pieces. Now that all the trim is done, it's time to build a deck. I started by measuring and marking where the deck would go, then making a bunch of holes for the posts that will support the deck. I put a bunch of stakes in the ground, then ran a string so I know exactly where to put my holes. I cut down some 4x4s and put them in the hole, made sure they were level and lined up with the string, then poured in a half bag of quickset cement and repeated the same process over and over until all of my posts were in place. I let the post set overnight, then got right back to it the next morning. To frame out this deck, I'm using a bunch of pressure treated 2x6s and basically making a frame around all the posts that I set yesterday. After cutting the excess 4x4s off, I started to hang my floor joists. I put two 3-inch decking screws in each one and spaced them out 16 in center. Once the deck was framed out and level, I added a joist hanger to each joist. This took all day to do, but the next morning we added a bunch of waterproof deck tape on top of all of the joists. This will prolong the life of the deck and reduce the amount of squeaking when you walk on it. We picked up a bunch of Trex deck boards and miter cut the first piece. This stuff is $34 a board, and we didn't want to ruin it with a bunch of screw holes on the top of it. So we picked up this camel jig that allows us to screw into the board from the side, which basically hides the screw holes, in turn leaving a nice consistent sleek finish look. Once the deck was finished, we went ahead and color matched some exterior paint and painted all the exposed edges just to give this deck a nice finished look, and man, I'll tell you, this made such a difference. It looks so much better. Now that the deck is completed, it's time to install the cable railing. We marked where each post would go, then pre-drilled holes directly into the deck frame. After seeing the Muzata cable railing system, I fell in love with the sleek design they offer, so I reached out and they custom designed my cable railing system so I had the perfect amount of product. I ran the cables through the holes, then crimped the adjustable bolts, and basically repeated the same process over and over again until all the cables were in the railings. I didn't tighten the cables until the handrails were installed, because the posts are level and squared, so tightening the cables would basically pull them inward, making them crooked. After all the cables were put in, it was time to install the handrail. I used my miter saw to cut the corner at a 45-degree angle, then carefully connected the railing together. What's cool about this handrail is that it has a channel grouped into it so that LEDs can be slid in, and a sleek protective cover. We installed the handrail, then went ahead and tightened up all the cables. And just like that, we have a deck with a cable railing system. I'll show you the way the LEDs light up later on in the video. I next installed the transitional piece in between the deck and the inside of this tiny home. I also installed some waterproof door and window tape to make sure no water gets down into the subfloor. We decided to turn the space into a home gym, so we picked up a major fitness home gym system and started putting it together. The original idea was to turn this tiny home into a short-term rental, but the city wouldn't let us, so we went with the next best option of turning it into a dream home gym. Since this is such a small space, we decided to pick up the Spirit B52 because it's a 5-in-1 training system in a single machine. This thing has a power rack, smith machine, cable pulley system, and a bunch of other cool features which will allow us to work out in our backyard. It took about 3 hours to put the whole thing together, and what's nice is that now I can cancel my gym membership. This was much easier to install than I expected, and I couldn't be happier with this home gym system. This entire project cost us about $15,000 and took a little over a month and a half to complete from start to finish.